The Bible you hold is not the same Bible every Christian has always held. That's not a conspiracy, it's history. For 3 centuries after Christ, the Church had no agreed canon. The 27-book New Testament wasn't listed until 367 CE, in a private letter almost no one has read. Most people picture the Council of Nicaea, Constantine, bishops voting on which books belong in the Bible and which get burned. That story is almost entirely false. It is one of the most repeated claims in popular culture. Dan Brown put it in a novel. It circles the internet. What actually happened raises a question the myth never asks. If Nicaea didn't choose the Bible, who did? The answer has always been available. Scholars have always known what Nicaea discussed. So why does the myth persist? Because it has a traceable genealogy. The story of books falling from an altar at Nicaea comes from the Sinaiticon Vetus, an anonymous Byzantine text from 887 CE. That is 562 years after Nicaea. No delegate wrote it. No church father near the council recorded it. A medieval invention. The Lutheran theologian Johannes Pappus published it in 1601. Voltaire distributed it. Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code did the rest. The real history starts with what Nicaea was actually convened to resolve. If those bishops didn't choose the books, who did? How did communities with no central authority converge on the same 27 books across a dozen languages and 300 years? The answer starts with a man the Church later declared a heretic. Nicaea was called to resolve one crisis, not which books were scripture, but who Christ was. Arius taught the Son was a created being, not co-eternal with the Father. The Council condemned that view, affirming the Son co-equal and fully divine. That was the agenda. Beyond the Creed, roughly 20 disciplinary canons, jurisdiction, clergy conduct, the date of Easter. 0 of those canons concern the contents of Scripture. Every surviving record of Nicaea is unanimous on this point. The canon was not discussed. When Constantine commissioned 50 copies of Scripture around 331 CE, he was copying an existing collection, not selecting what it would contain. Nicaea did not choose the Bible. The process that did was far more interesting, and starts with a man remembered as a heretic. His name was Marcion of Sinope, a wealthy shipowner from Pontus on the Black Sea. He arrived in Rome around 140 CE with a specific theological agenda. Marcion believed the God of the Hebrew Scriptures was inferior to the God revealed by Jesus. He rejected the entire Old Testament, and he proposed the first deliberately defined Christian canon in documented history, 11 books, a version of Luke, and 10 letters of Paul. When Rome expelled Marcion in 144 CE, the Proto-Orthodox faced a new problem. He had a defined canon. Rejecting it required naming their own. That pressure, forced to answer a question nobody had formally answered, is what historians call the catalytic moment. Marcion didn't create the canon, he forced its creation. The earliest surviving response is an 85-line Latin text called the Muratorian Fragment, discovered in Milan in 1740, dated to the late 2nd century. The fragment accepts the 4 Gospels, Acts, Paul's letters, and Revelation. It excludes the Shepherd of Hermas on chronological grounds, written too recently to be apostolic. But even with criteria in use, the early church did not agree. Important texts remained disputed for generations. One phrase coined just before Nicaea captures exactly how uncomfortable that uncertainty was. Around 313 CE, Eusebius of Caesarea was completing his church history. The status of many texts was unclear, so he divided them. Acknowledged books, accepted without dispute, and the Antilegomena, the books spoken against, not heretical, just contested. The contested list will surprise you. James, Jude, 2 Peter, 2 and 3 John, and Revelation, which most Western Christians today treat as obviously canonical. These weren't fringe communities questioning those books. These were major centers of Christian thought. The Shepherd of Hermas was cited as scripture by Irenaeus around 180 CE, called inspired by Origen, and bound inside Codex Sinaiticus, one of the oldest near-complete Bibles ever found. The Shepherd of Hermas was inside a Bible. The reason it didn't make the canon, too recent to be apostolic. The myth gets it backwards. The church wasn't hiding books. It was trying to find them, asking which books go back to the apostles. That answer, when it finally came, arrived not from a council or an emperor, but from a bishop writing an Easter memo in Egypt. Athanasius of Alexandria attended Nicaea as a young deacon. He spent his career defending Nicaea's decision, exiled 5 times. Every year, the Bishop of Alexandria sent festal letters to announce Easter, administrative documents, not occasions for theological history. In 367 CE, his 39th festal letter broke the pattern. Concerned people were reading dubious texts as scripture. He listed which texts actually qualified. Exactly 27 books. The same 27 in the New Testament of every Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox Bible today. Athanasius uses the language of canonization in this letter. First documented use of that language for a 27-book list. But this was a bishop's directive to his own churches, not an ecumenical council, not binding on Constantinople, Antioch, or Rome. 2 regional councils, Hippo in 393 CE and Carthage in 397 CE, confirmed the same list. Regional confirmations, not decrees. Convergent, not imposed. 3 criteria shaped that convergence: apostolicity, connection to the apostles, Catholicity, use across communities, and doctrinal coherence, alignment with Christological consensus. Those criteria sound clean on paper. The history is interesting because they were messy in practice. Origen addressed the authorship of Hebrews directly. The thoughts are Pauline, but the style belongs to someone else. His verdict, preserved by Eusebius, who wrote the epistle, in truth God knows, he still regarded it as authoritative. Jerome had reservations about Hebrews, James, Jude, and 2 Peter. He included all 4. His letters document the hesitation. His translation documents the decision. Martin Luther, in his 1522 preface, called James an epistle of straw. He later removed that designation. Even Luther stopped short of permanently altering the table of contents. The canon held. Now consider what didn't make the list, not suppressed, but unable to satisfy the same criteria that kept Luther's doubts in check. The Didache was cited as authoritative by multiple church fathers. Athanasius placed it in a secondary tier, useful for instruction, not canonical. The Gospel of Thomas, 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, no narrative, is the most prominent Gnostic text, discovered in 1945 near Nag Hammadi, unread for 1,500 years. Most scholars date Thomas to the 2nd or 3rd century. These texts represent a different tradition, secret knowledge, spiritual resurrection, a cosmology distant from proto-Orthodox Christianity. The record doesn't support suppression at Nicaea. They were already marginal before 325 CE. What the evidence shows is not power brokers selecting convenient texts. It is communities in different cities, different languages, converging on the same answer. So here is what happened. The canon was not chosen at Nicaea, not invented by Constantine, not decreed by any single moment. Marcion forced the question in 144 CE. The Muratorian Fragment gave the first list. Eusebius documented the contested books. Athanasius listed exactly 27 in 367 CE. The 3 criteria, apostolic origin, broad acceptance, Christological consistency, were applied to every candidate. The Shepherd of Hermas failed the first. James and Revelation cleared all 3. Scholars read that history differently. Bart Ehrman argues different accidents could have produced a different canon. Others argue the texts carried an authority communities kept confirming. The historical record establishes what happened and leaves the theological interpretation open. What you do not need to bring is the myth. The history stands on its own. The people who shaped this canon were not conspirators. They asked which texts connected them to the apostles. 300 years of that question produced the book you have. The myth, Nicaea Constantine, books falling from an altar, is 562 years younger than the council it describes. The real story required no myth. It was always more interesting. The history of the biblical canon is more complex and more human than the popular version. Understanding that doesn't flatten the text, it deepens it. Origen doubted who wrote Hebrews. Jerome had reservations about James. Luther demoted Revelation. The Shepherd of Hermas was bound inside the oldest surviving Bibles. None of that makes the New Testament less. It makes the story of how it survived more remarkable. These communities didn't have an emperor handing down a list. They had criteria.